Hello, everybody. Today is October 22nd, and this is the OLM Dev Working Group meeting. Thank you for being here. On the agenda, we're going to discuss how to protect privilege escalation for subscription creators, and we're going to discuss API management, and it seems like Chris is throwing on a few more items, so there will be a little bit, we'll get to those new items when we get to them. So, Chris, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. So let's see here. So the idea here is that I think a lot of customers are expecting, we've noticed that folks are using namespace scoped resources in a way that is expecting all the permissions of that namespace scoped resource and the context of the user creating those resources to prevent privileged escalation. So for example, when you create a deployment, that deployment runs as a service account, and that service account is what's used to create all the pod and so forth. You're not allowed to create that deployment unless you also have the ability to create the pod. So basically all that thing happens, you're all inside that security domain. And then Kubernetes does all of that work to make sure you're not elevating your privileges. So the subscription object completely destroys that because, of course, the subscription object is being used by OLM, which has cluster admin, which basically creates operators and stuff with whatever its defined privileges are. So it completely ignores that whole privilege escalation concept, right? So it breaks the spirit of what I think customers are expecting from a resource privilege escalation perspective. So with that in mind, and I realize the reason why subscriptions, so the problem is subscriptions are in the namespace scope, so you can handle the, which kind of goes to my last thing about operator groups. It does that so you can do this, have multiple instances of the operator and so forth to have kind of a poor man's multi-tenancy. And I know there is some thought about removing or not using or not recommending, I would say, namespace scoped subscriptions and instead having all namespace or cluster scoped ones. So I just wanted to kind of get an idea of, should we be telling all of our customers that subscriptions are really meant to be used by cluster admins? They're not meant to be used by namespace admins because they actually do things beyond the scope of what that namespace would normally allow.
Okay. Anybody on the OLM team can chime in if they don't like the answer I'm going to provide, but I very strongly believe that installing an operator needs to be considered as you making a modification to the control plane of Kubernetes and should be reserved for a very privileged cluster admin. I don't believe you should provide it to namespace admins when you're using OLM. And I think by default, our upstream version, there is no concept as a namespace admin. It's strictly,
yeah, so that's a problem in OCP, because guess what? The operator can be created by the admin cluster role.
Yes, so we reckon, I don't want to go too into that because that's OpenShift specific, and that's more of a product management problem that we need to discuss, or problem for them to solve. Right. And I would direct you to bring that conversation up with that team when you speak with them. But for the purposes of upstream, yes, this is an extremely privileged privilege that should be reserved for cluster admins if they're going to be installing operators or creating subscriptions.
I do want to say that OLM doesn't always create, this is Nick, OLM doesn't always create the resources in a bundle with the permissions of OLM's service account. If there's an operator group in the namespace that has a service account specified in it, then those permissions are actually used to scope all of the commands that are executed to apply bundles and install plans to the cluster. So you do, like, if you control the operator group in a namespace and you control the service account and the privileges that are bound to that, and you prevent your users in that namespace from messing with the operator group resource, then you can actually prevent them from escalating their privileges through OLM's service account.
Can you write that down?
Yeah, we actually have
It
a
is.
document. I can send it to you.
Yeah, it's in there, Chris. But and I
Okay,
think
all
this
right.
kind of leads to your bottom point, though.
Yeah.
Are operator groups a strategic resource we should be betting the farm on?
I don't know if
Or
betting
Kevin, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, Nick, were you going?
I was just going to say that anything we have now, from the perspective of downstream, which I know we said we weren't going to get too much into it, we have 3 release, what is it? SLO, I suppose, if that's the right term, on any features that we have. And we always will try to provide graceful migrations from whatever things that we have currently in the past. And we try not to take tons of things away from you after we've already given them to you. So it may be a different form and it may be a migration. I don't know if other people want to add to that or correct me somewhere.
Well, okay. So some certain people from our area was told by other certain people that operator groups probably shouldn't be used because they don't work really well. And so you shouldn't be depending on those capabilities. And so they're really saying you really use the own namespace where the operator and the operands are in the same namespace, or you should just use the all namespaces or cluster scope. Don't use any of the other ones that are in the middle, even though the single namespace one, where you essentially have 2 namespaces, one for the operator and one for the operand, that is the most secure pattern, which is the one I would love everybody to use. So I'm trying to figure out what do we do?
I will attempt to lay some of this out. I'm not sure where you heard that own namespace is preferable. It's definitely not because of the privilege escalation issue that you pointed out.
No, I'm not saying own namespace is preferable. I'm just saying the downstream UI only does own namespace and all namespaces.
Yeah. So yeah, those are those product decisions that Alex was alluding to.
Yeah, I understand.
I think from the perspective, so like this is kind of my perspective of not just OLM, but the Kubernetes landscape right now, is that there is not a good multi-tenancy solution. And there's not a good way to really have multiple controllers for operators managing the same APIs. Like you said, poor man's multi-tenancy. We have operator groups. We would love something that works better. We've been involved in some conversations upstream about some of that, but there's just nothing there right now. So it's kind of like we want to move away from operator groups, but to what would we move? The best thing we can say right now is the best UX for everyone involved, both administrators and users, is to treat all operators as pretend every operator is the deployment controller, right? It provides an API to every user in the cluster. And if you want to build if you want that controller to manage multiple subsets, you can build that into your controller. But that gives the best experience for everyone involved, excuse me. So to summarize, like we don't have a plan. We want to move to something better than operator groups because there are deficiencies there that there are gaps that we'd like to fill, but we don't know what we would move to. And right now, operator groups are a requirement for installation. So
have we got those gaps documented somewhere? So that, I mean, we're never going to come up with something better unless we can enumerate what the gaps are and why we want to fix them.
Yes, well, I think Nick sent out probably a couple months ago now, one of a bunch of documents that we took notes on this stuff. I know, Nick, if you can dig up the link again.
Yeah.
It's definitely a lot. There are, and like I said, there's just, we don't know of anything upstream that fills the gap completely. Essentially everything's forking Kubernetes to solve the problem. And that's not really what we want to do.
Yeah.
So one of the things, so we have customers who are freaking out about cluster scoped operators. They don't like that. They don't like own operator. They like the single namespace one. And so that's kind of what I would like to start advocating within our company, is that everybody start using at least all namespace, at least those three, right? Not the multi namespace one, but I would like to start using the single namespace one, where you essentially have two namespaces for every operator, because the operator and the operand, because that gives customers the most granularity from a security domain perspective. From your perspective, forgetting downstreams not having great support for that, do you think that is a well-trod path, or should I read this document and find out what all the warts are in there?
I think you should read the document and find the warts, or
Okay.
try to think of some. The major one I could talk about is, or to give you like a hint of one of the biggest ones, I think, is when you have to deal with dependencies, and now installing an operator more than once in a cluster that's dependent on other operators that can be configured to different scopes like that. And even for single namespace, this means that we would need to install all of the dependencies multiple times, pointing to the target namespace. And now we can't have version skew between, we can't have multiple different versions of an operator running in different namespaces that may or may not be useful. So once you start to mix scopes, it gets...
Yeah, let's maybe we should segue from that into what James is going to talk about, because that might solve some of this. It's kind of a pattern that we're thinking about to try to decouple the API away from the controller, because they're munched together right now, and they have different, like you just said, they have different domains, right? One's definitely cluster scope. The other one doesn't have to be, right? And in fact, it isn't, because it's got things running. I'm wondering if we should, I don't know.
that sounds interesting. I don't know if anybody else has anything to say before we segue into that. I'm going to go dig up the link while we decide.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Just before we jump off the topic, I'll mention that I definitely used to have the perspective that single namespace was probably the best way to run operators in general. But my opinion changed over time based on features that Kubernetes introduced. So for example, conversion webhooks cannot be restricted to a single namespace. So if you decide to install two operators that are different versions, have the same APIs, you have one conversion webhook, one of them wins, one of them controls the versioning. It's not completely insurmountable, but the UX just keeps getting worse and worse and worse as you start talking about that.
Yeah, this is exactly what James is going to talk about. So I think this is awesome.
Great. So I think we can move on and hand things off to James then.
Okay. So I tried to write some notes on the agenda that hopefully speak for themselves, but in general, it's some of the issues, like Chris said, that we've just been talking about. I know that a lot of operator developers start to come unstuck when you start telling them, okay, well, how can we run two versions of your operator at the same time, and how does this stuff all work because of those interdependency problems. So I was thinking that we should split out controller packages and API packages, and that we should have a kind of a separate mechanism for them. Now, there is a way that internally within our company that we're thinking, well, we could do this without needing to make OLM changes by saying we've got an API operator and a controller operator, right? So I'm going to talk about it in those terms because it's what I've been thinking about it in. But the idea would be that if I wanted an operator for my product, I would create an API operator first, and that defines the API for the CR, and put that in its own package, and then don't have anything else in it, no controller or anything, right? Going forwards, when that API changes, what would also go into that API operator would be the conversion webhook. So there would be one conversion webhook, one API operator for the API. And then on the other side, I would also have my controller operator. And in my controller operator is where I would drag in the API using some kind of Go module to pull in the API so that I can interact with it. In my CSV, I could declare my dependency on that on a specific version of the API and say that's the version of the API that this controller operator is using. And then OLM can do the work to say, okay, well, you want to install this product operator. It needs v1 beta 2 of the API, and that's provided by this API operator over there, and install it. If I then made another version of my operator that used the same API, it could also depend on v1 beta 2. And OLM would say, well, I've already got this API operator installed, so I just need to run this operator again in another namespace or wherever it is, and you kind of separate that API concern. And one of the things that helps with is just helping the developers understand, well, actually, I need to be more consistent with my API, and I can't just change it with every operator version, or I can't change it easily. I have to think about that more closely, and it takes away that kind of cluster scope, namespace scope problem quite a lot, because the main reason for needing for operators being cross-cluster is the API. So we try and move all of the concerns about conversion and storage and everything into the API package, and then we can kind of separate those concerns and try and provide maybe some tooling around helping people understand what compatible API changes are, and fuzzing techniques for conversion webhooks and things like that we could try and build into the operator SDK, and then the actual operators themselves could be much more closely scoped to namespaces, and it would be easier to run two different operators from two different channels, because you could, if the API package had the right APIs. Some of the specifics on that from the agenda, things like it would be OLM's job to make sure that you can't install the controller operator if the API operator doesn't have the right version of the API available. You can't remove or upgrade an API operator if that would mean you take away the version of an API that a controller operator is using, right? So we can put some of those restrictions in. But again, I think that's simpler than what we currently have, where OLM, you installed an operator and it's installing a CRD, and then you've got to try and work out, well, if I uninstall that operator, do I also uninstall the CRD, and how does that compete with the CRD from this other operator or this other operator version? Yeah, I've been talking for a while. Does the idea make sense? Do people understand what I'm suggesting and why?
I think I'm grasping it, and I think it, at a high level, it makes sense. Like if you had this API operator, you could write all the conversion webhook logic there so that it serves it correctly to everything else, right?
And I'm using that API operator term in terms of, I could do that now with OLM. Correct. But actually what I prefer is if OLM changed and said, okay, well, we've got controller packages and we've got API packages, and API packages are never scoped and controller packages can be scoped, right? So OLM would actually treat them differently and work differently.
Yeah, it's just interesting because you would be fundamentally, I guess we kind of already do this today, but like you're saying that like the behavior of installing a resource can change per namespace basically at that point, right? Like if I create a CR in namespace A and I would create the same CR in namespace B, it can, we get different experiences in each case, which is
but that already is different depending on what namespace your operator is watching, and if you've got more than one operator installed at different levels.
Yep.
Assuming they have compatible CRDs.
Yeah. I don't see any reason this doesn't work. I think if we want to like pursue it, we'd need like a RFE and stuff to discuss it at more.
Oh yeah, I mean, I only had the idea yesterday, So I thought, seeing as this meeting was on, I'd bring it up and see what people's first thoughts are. I'm happy to write it up a little more formally in an RFE, but I didn't want to do that if people just turned around and said, well, that doesn't make sense because of this requirement that we've had forever, or we've tried that in the past and it doesn't work because, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea. It's interesting. I think the operator pattern is controller plus CRDs plus APIs. So when we're talking about an API operator that just consists of CRDs, essentially, I think that it's more like a break out the APIs into a separate package and have a looser coupling between the API package and the controller. So because both those things make up the term operator. So I just want to be like more technical about it. It's like API package.
So we would need to, if we were still going to say install this operator, then we'd have to think about what that actually means, and maybe we need some sort of operator metadata above both of those packages. And when we say install this operator, what you mean is install an API package and a controller package.
Yeah. You could get around it right now if, you know, like the API operator would just always have to be global, right? You wouldn't want multiple versions of the API operator installed, right?
Well, I would just caution about getting around it right now, because we have a lot of built-in validation that assumes that your APIs and your controller are in the same package. Like in terms of building a bundle, it would fail validation right now. So maybe it would work on cluster.
An operator without any CRDs fail validation?
Yes, I think so.
Wait,
hold on, that's not true.
Maybe
that's not true. So I just want to speak real quick. So before I get sidetracked. So I think Jim already mentioned this, that technically speaking, you can do this with OM right now. I think Jim mentioned that because you can technically just having an operator with a bunch of CRD, essentially API, and then kind of a dummy controller that doing nothing, just to installing the CRD to enable the API, and another operator mainly having no CRD at all, just having a deployment, the controller that actually doing that. So from a technical standpoint, nothing stops you from doing that. But again, there's no clear distinction about those two components within operator as we define it at the moment. So I think that what James suggested is actually interesting, not on the API standpoint, because to me, that's just basically just a CID thing. It's not really anything new, but on the controller side, actually interesting in the way that at the moment we're just installing the controller, the deployment, and we had no further information on what that controller is doing, because it's essentially just an image, and you don't know what kind of API it's controlling, because there's no metadata or anything like that to tell you what that controller is doing or managing. That's totally up to the operator author to handling that. So it's an interesting point to separate them out and having a bit more info in order to OM to having a bit further control on that. I think that's an interesting point. But
so there's probably no context. There is probably some context on what the operator needs both from the RBAC. So if you were to make a CSV that, let's say, requires that API be installed but does not provide it, we have context that it needs permissions to do something with that. So we do sort of have an idea of what it's doing.
I really like this idea, and I can't think of anything like egregiously difficult about it up front. We definitely want to think through it and make sure it's more reasonable to actually do. We've talked about a similar. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, on first thought, do you think it solves any of the problems we've been talking about, or other problems?
It does. It does sound like it solves a few problems, and I was going to say that we've talked about a similar pattern in the past, but for a completely different reason. Because today it's really hard to support, I guess, what I call ingress style controllers. We have one API, but multiple completely different implementations of controllers that interact with the same one.
Yep.
And so, yeah, if you factor out the API into its own package, I think the blocker at the time was what Dan brought up, which is that we don't currently, it's just a validation issue. We don't let you not provide a CSV. But if we just provide a conversion webhook with everything, we don't even have to relax anything right now. So I'd be interested in definitely like digging into this and exploring it and seeing if it can solve some of the problems that we've been talking about. Yeah.
So I'll try and write it up slightly more formally as an RFE, and I'll try and post that in Slack, and then maybe at next week's kind of roadmap meeting we can talk more about it.
I think so. So this is Joe from the SDK team, and his C put a comment in the chat that I wanted to touch on a little bit. I think like from an upstream perspective, it seems like there are lots and lots and lots of operator developers that don't have this concern and don't want to deal with the complexity of having two separate things that are deployed, and want to just be able to say, I'm a cluster admin, or I'm going to allow only cluster admins to deploy my thing, and it's going to be watching all namespaces. And as Evan said, it's going to look and feel just like the deployment controller. And I want everyone on the cluster to be able to interact with this API in the same way. And I'm going to limit access based on RBAC rules, just like I do with everything else. So I think it's really important that whatever we come up with doesn't break that workflow.
Yeah, I put a couple of notes into the agenda about what I thought the changes from the SDK perspective would be. And I think you probably still could do it in one kind of Git project. It's just you'd need to split up the API module in Go from the controller in Go. And then the operator SDK's commands to kind of build bundles and things would need to know about that and be able to work with that.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that like, it seems to me like this is a very particular niche use case that you want to be able to opt into rather than opt out of or enforce, you know what I mean? Like, I think the general workflow from an SDK user's perspective is what I was describing. But if you do have this use case where you have more concerns about multi-tenancy, then I think I would agree, like it seems like we should be able to come up with a way to support separating out the APIs from the controllers.
I kind of disagree there. I don't think that this is niche. I think this is something that as many people's operators grow, they will kind of grow into these kind of concerns. And I think that it's probably better practice and might encourage better developer behavior if we say to them, okay, so this is your API package and this is your controller, right? And get them to think in that way when they first start making operators. But at the moment, there's already a learning curve of how these things work. Separating those concerns isn't, I think, going to make it any more difficult to be able to create an operator.
I don't know if I agree. I get the impression that OLM is kind of complex as it is, and for good reason. And I think this is like more complexity potentially. That's like, now I've got to have two bundles and they interact with each other. Whereas right now it's like just one thing and I can do my one thing.
Yeah.
So I feel like
in a way, yes, but in another way, I think it's less complex because you're separating those kind of cluster scope concerns from the controller concerns. Which
I would argue if you do it the way we're doing it today, you're hiding the fact of this complexity is there. And I think you're just hiding the fact, and you're making it easy the go button, making it easy to get started and hang yourself. That's the way I think of it.
I think what I'm trying to say is that for a large class of, well, maybe, I don't know what the class of users is, but for some class of users, they're treating their controller as if it's just like the deployment controller. Sure. You don't have the deployment controller that has like these kind of things where it behaves one way in one namespace and one way in the other namespace. It's a cluster scope thing. Everyone has the exact same accesses in terms of what the API means. There's one controller for it, and you control it with RBAC to say you can create this resource in this namespace or not. And I feel like lots of people have that use case. So maybe what I'm saying is there should be a mode potentially where you can package everything together, but if you do that, then it has to be cluster scoped. It has to be all namespaces.
Potentially, or yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with your point that what we don't want to do is that this is a fairly big change, right? This is quite disruptive, and what we don't want to do is just lose any of the momentum that we have from operator developers and ease of use of the operator SDK. And we don't really want to have huge shifts in that in the process that developers go through to use the operator SDK. We've already just moved to Code Builder, and that's already kind of been a fairly big change. We don't want too much instability. So if we're going to do anything like this, we need to very carefully think about all of the implications for people using the operator SDK, for how OLM works, for how we'd migrate from older clusters, for whether we would still support the older packages and try and do them both at the same time, right? All of those decisions that need to be made very carefully. I fully agree with that.
Do you think this is something that would impact like the actual scaffolding of Go code or any other operator type in a project? Like, I guess what the real question I'm asking is, do we need to go and get the Cube Builder community to buy into this?
I would like it to affect scaffolding, and yes, we may very well need to get Cube Builder involved. But maybe that's further down the road. Maybe we need to prove something out ourselves first. Yeah, good question.
Cool. Yeah, I would agree. I think if we're going to do something like this, it would be good to have the Cube Builder community on board.
Yeah.
This is Nick. I would like to say that I think the important delineation here between the two lines of thinking is really how you view tenancy in a cluster. Do you view tenancy as multi-cluster, which is what the upstream community seems to be going towards? Or do you view a cluster as a set of tenants delineated by namespace, which may have different cluster extensions depending on what they work on? It's still, even if you separate the behavior from the API and you have separate behaviors per bucket of tenants, it's still a cluster extension. And none of the, I think, real difficult scoping questions go away. We just have to deal with them in smaller chunks.
Yep.
But that may be an overgeneralization. So it'd be cool to see kind of like a write-up of your thoughts. And then we can kind of like look into this plus the things that I actually put the links to our thoughts on all of this in the document, so we can kind of shake it up.
Cool.
I think one thing that's attractive about this solution is that we can do it with all of the current abstractions we have today. And we can basically, if we go through the details and this seems like it makes sense, then we can just write a document of guidance and say, this is what we plan to do, and then have a nice long, if this seems like the thing that we need to do, have a nice long transition path, make sure every I is dotted and T is crossed before we start enforcing anything.
Yeah.
I think today we'd still need label properties, right? To be able to say, this is, I need this API, but I want this behavior. Or are you envisioning that they would just take the package of the behavior and it would require the API?
I was thinking that, I mean, maybe I should just, yeah, maybe we all have different ideas of what this is. I was imagining that you would have one package that provided the API. So you'd have a CSV in there. It has a deployment. The deployment just has a conversion webhook and nothing else, and has all the config to point to the conversion webhook to it. And then it would claim that it owns whatever APIs, like etcd cluster, the traditional example. And that would be it. And then you have another package that's like etcd operator, not etcd API. And etcd operator would take out a dependency. Ideally, I think we'd go ahead and have compound constraints for this. So you'd say it requires the etcd cluster API, and it requires a provider of a minimum version, because I think you need that for API guarantees, that you're not using a field in an API version that's not there yet. And then, so you specify that as a dependency, and then as your deployment, you'd specify your actual controller. And so you'd pick etcd operator to install, you get the API installed if it's not already, or fail if you don't have enough permission to create that. And I think we have some, like you said, Nick, I think this doesn't solve all of the operator group problems, because you need to go to a cluster scoped operator group to install the API first, and then go over to a namespace to install the etcd operator. Like that, you can do that. That we probably have to do that today, but you can easily imagine a world where we just do that automatically.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense for an API package to be in an operator group, because it is a cluster scope resource. That's why I was saying we could do it by kind of using two different packages as is, but really the right thing to do would be in the future to treat API packages just differently entirely.
Quick question. I mean, is it not true that, I mean, today if you were deploying in a namespace, your dependencies also have to be in a namespace, right?
Yep.
So are we breaking that contract here? I mean, if we're saying we would want to deploy our controller at the namespace scope, we somehow need to be able to put a dependency on something that's cluster scope now, right?
So you can absolutely install. Let's say we have the API package, right? You can install that in an operator group that is scoped everywhere, and it provides the API for every namespace. And then you can afterwards install the actual controller in any namespace, because the API it requires will be in, we will be present in the namespace that it's installed in. The issue that I think you're bringing up is that if you went straight to install the controller, the API would fail to install because it's in the namespace, but there's no reason you can't just do that other step first and then install the operator and have it work.
Well, yeah, I think we're projecting out, and there's a few issues today with the way that scope mixing works. Mm-hmm. So I think we've projected, in a lot of the people, including myself talking here, have projected past, like, we know that's an issue, and that needs to change regardless of what we do. If anybody thought differently, then
yeah, I think Joe's point really was if you install one of the controller operators at a namespace scope, it would depend on the API controller at a namespace scope, and then you would no longer be able to install the API operator, the API package at the cluster level because of the operator group problem, right? So again, it's kind of places where you could just about work around it with OLM as it is, but really it would be better if OLM changed and was able to say, well, this is an API package, this depends on it, but it can't be installed namespace scope, so it has to be installed cluster scope.
You got it, James.
Well, I mean, you could just make it so that the controller fails if you went straight for installing the controller. Like, it wouldn't resolve at all. Like, it would just fail the installation if the other operator didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we could.
Namespace scope, then yes, it would fail, but that wouldn't be a very nice customer experience.
No, absolutely not. I'm just kidding. No, I'm just getting in the weeds. I'm sorry, but that might be like a slightly separate RFE. That's probably more achievable in the near term. I would suspect, and it's probably one we could do.
Yeah. So maybe I should open that as a way to make this work with minimal changes to OLM, so that if we wanted to do that inside IBM, we could.
Yep.
And then going forwards, kind of say, well, this might be a good direction for OLM as a bigger dot all the I's, cross all the T's exercise.
Yeah. So I think we should definitely capture that install problem, right? Like, just the OLM fails install this operator because another operator is in a separate, or it doesn't support the install mode of the operator that requires it, then that might be a good thing to just track and get an RFE out there.
Yeah.
Somewhat unrelated question. I know we've been talking about how the API package would provide the conversion webhook. Would it also need to provide any admission webhooks?
I would say no. I would say the admission webhooks are more to do with the operator, with the controllers, than with the conversion.
Does the API server know which webhook to ask about particular CRs?
If you have admission webhooks, if you have more than one admission webhook that applies to one object, it will call them all round robin style.
And
We
okay?
do scope it. OLM scopes the admission admission webhooks to the namespaces that the operator. Well, it looks at the operator group and it sees all the namespaces, and then it puts a namespace selector on the admission webhook so that only intercepts the objects created in those namespaces. So it shouldn't have multiple. They shouldn't intersect just based on the existence of operator groups.
Cool. Thanks.
I should note that the thing that we've talked about, ingress style operators, I believe the actual upstream ingress stuff moved away from that for the sort of like duct taping pattern where each of the APIs has a set of fields that matches a higher order interface. And then those are treated separately. So this pattern that is now moved away from, just as a little sidebar.
Yep. I haven't looked into it for ages, so. It always was a bit weird the way they were doing that, but.
Yeah. So James, is there any additional information you want from us before you go down the path of writing the RFE? Or sorry,
no, I just wanted to float it up the flagpole before I put too much effort in.
Cool. But yeah, I think the general consensus is that there doesn't seem to be a reason you can't do that, and we'd love to see what you write. So we'll look forward to that.
Cool. I will do that. That'll be fun.
Okay, let me see, was anything added to the end of this? I don't believe anything else is on the agenda, so I think we can finish 12 minutes early unless anybody has anything else they want to address.
There's a bunch of comments in the chat that are probably worth copying and pasting into the minute. Obviously, the meeting's going to disappear for me, but.
Okay, I'll add this to the meeting minutes. All right, well, I think that's everything then. I'm going to end the meeting then.
Cool.
So thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for the discussion, and I will see you all in a week or two.
Thank you.
you.